Hello, class. This is Mr. Burnett. Today we're going to be talking about gerrymandering. It may not be a word you've come across before, but now that you've heard it, my guess is you will remember that word. It's so unusual sounding. So the subtitle for this lesson is a funny word, but serious issue. Now, before I get in to the substance of the lecture, let's look at this map of Texas that I have on the screen. I know I put it pretty faded so I can type over it, but I think you can see it well enough for our purposes. And look here. Well, first of all, these are Texas's congressional districts. Texas sends 36 representatives to the House of Representatives in D.C. We elect them every 2 years, and they represent Texas. And each of these numbered and different colored areas makes up a district. So in other words, look at District 23. Right here, I will draw a little line sort of around it. All right, this is Texas's 23rd. And as you can see, this takes up much of West Texas, or you could before the line just magically went away. But if you look in the Dallas-Fort Worth region, the districts are so small that you can't even draw them all on the map. They just list the numbers out here and draw a line to them. Same in the Houston area. And today we're going to learn why that is. Why is there one congressional district that takes up, a huge swath of the state? And then why do some districts are so small that they don't even fit on the map? And it all goes back to the Great Compromise. I'm going to ask you to think back to 8th grade history for a minute. And if you remember, when the Founding Fathers went to the Constitutional Convention, 1787, they had a big controversy and a big disagreement as to how the legislative branch was going to be configured. Small states, such as New Jersey, argued that each state should have equal representation in Congress. That's how it was under the Articles of Confederation, and the small states wanted to keep it that way under the Constitution. But the larger states, mainly being led by Virginia, said, no, that's not fair. Virginia has more people than any other state at the time. Virginia should have more power in Congress. And this is a real problem. And they, this threatened to derail their chances of agreeing to a constitution. So they came up with a Great Compromise to basically satisfy both the small and the large states. And what they did is they came up with a bicameral system. Our Congress has 2 houses. The Senate is based on equal representation, 2 senators per state. So put it in modern times, California, the biggest state in the country, has 2 senators. Places like Montana, Rhode Island, Vermont, these very small states, they also have 2 senators. Texas, the second largest state in both size and population, has 2 senators. That was to make the small states happy, the Senate. But the drafters of the Constitution also created the House of Representatives, and this is based on population. So we call it proportional representation. And so 435 representatives have to be divided up among the 50 states. And in this House of Congress and House of Representatives, California and Texas are going to get a whole lot more than some of those smaller states. And the way we know how many states get how many representatives is every 10 years, like in 2020, the country takes a census to determine how many people are in each state. And then based on what percentage of the population is in that particular state, they'll receive a certain percentage of the 435 House seats. Now to put some real numbers on that, this chart or map I have up is based on the 2010 census. And as you can see, Texas has 36 representatives. California, all right, look, they have 53. But places like Montana, Wyoming, Delaware, Vermont, they only get one representative each. So here, representation is not equal among the states. The bigger your state, and when I say bigger, it's all about population. For instance, Alaska, in terms of land, is the largest state, but you'll see they only have one representative. Texas, the second largest state according to land, they have 36 representatives. That's because there's so many more people that live in Texas than Alaska. So now within each state, it's all well and good to say, okay, Texas gets 36 representatives. So we'll just divide the Texas into 36 districts. And that's the term we use, district. A district is the area that is represented by a single House member. So it's all well and good to say, okay, Texas gets 36 districts, but as you know, Texas isn't a perfect geometric shape. It's not a perfect circle or square or rectangle. All right, it's an odd shape where the borders are made up by in a lot of cases rivers or Gulfs of Mexico's. All right, so Texas has this unique shape. So how do you divide it up evenly and fairly? And Texas isn't alone at this. Most states are not, shaped like a perfect square or rectangle. And most shapes are very unique. So the question is, how do you divide them up? Which then leads to the question, how do you fairly divide them up? Because we can come up with some ways to divide Texas, but it wouldn't necessarily be fair. For instance, let me point you to, let's talk about this map for a minute. The dark green areas, that represents areas where the population is less than 10 persons per square mile. All right, so if you have a square mile of land, there may be fewer than 10 people living there. And it changes colors, getting more and more populous based on the color change until you get to the red, which you see in Dallas County, Tarrant County, which is where Fort Worth is, Collin County, which is where Plano and McKinney are, Harris County with Houston, Travis County, Austin, Bexar County, San Antonio. You see these large population centers, and in there were more than 1,000 people living for every square mile. All right, so if you mark off the square mile in these areas, you're going to have, on average, 1,000 or more people living there. So because the population of a state is not divided equally throughout the land, all right, it leads to challenges as to how you draw up these congressional districts. All right, so again, here's the map that's been in the background on all these other screens. And as you see, the 23rd district is much, much bigger than these 6 districts shoved in the Dallas-Fort Worth region, or the 5 districts shoved into the Houston region. Okay. And it's because of population density, based on the screen we just saw. That it is not at all easy to figure out how to draw these areas equally, because to get to this one person, one vote concept that we'll talk about later, means the districts necessarily have to be different sizes in terms of land. Areas where there are fewer people lead to bigger districts. Areas like Houston or Dallas where there are more people lead to smaller districts. All right. So to put this in contrast, let's just talk about a couple of different places. One, let's talk about where most or all of us live, Dallas County. Based on what I read earlier today, there's about 2.6 million people living in Dallas County. All right, so that's 2,600,000 plus people in Dallas County. Here, I'll point it out to you. There's a place called Loving County. It is this county right here. All right, that's Loving County, Texas. As of 2017, there were 169 people living there. And I don't mean 169,000 people or 1.69 million people. No, I mean 169 people. Now that was a few years ago, so I don't know, maybe it's ballooned all the way up to like 170 people now, or maybe it's dipped to 168 people now. I don't know. But the point is, there are many, many, many more people living in Dallas County than Loving County. So this is why you can't just draw these districts to be the same shape and size, because people don't live in the same proportions throughout a geographic region. Now, it's difficult enough to come up with how to draw these districts to where you have the same number of people in a particular district. But the real challenge, or at least the real controversy, comes when people start drawing these districts in a way to favor one group or another. And when they do that, that is called gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is a term we use when congressional districts are drawn in a way that favors one group of people versus another. All right, so a little side note, why the silly, funny name? It's because this practice has been going on for more than 200 years. All right, back in 1812, the Massachusetts governor, Elbridge Gerry, tried to draw Massachusetts state districts that favored his party. He is a member of the Democratic Republicans Party. Remember, now those are the names of our two biggest parties. Back then, that was a single party. So Gerry tried to draw the Massachusetts state districts in a way that favored his political party. And a local newspaper said that the district looked like a salamander. Now, this drawing over here on the right, that looks more like a dragon of some sort than a salamander to me. But nonetheless, a local newspaper called it or described it as a salamander. So they just took those two words from Gerry, who tried drawing it like a salamander, and hence the word gerrymander was born. Now, we're going to spend some time on these graphics on the right to explain how gerrymandering can lead to some unfair or unjust results. All right, so let's pretend this square here, each of these boxes, well, it's not each, these are all the same state. All right, so pretend we have a state here, all right, based on this rectangle. It's a very geographically straight state. You have a state here. And there are 60 members of the Orange political party, or 60% are part of the Orange political party. I'm sorry, let's start this all over again. You have a state right here. And within this state, let's just say, to make it easy, there are 100 people. 60 of those people are orange, 40% or 40 are purple. Actually, the graphic says 50, so fine. Let's call it 50. Okay. It makes the math a little bit harder because I can't use round numbers, but fine. Out of these 50 people, 30 are orange, which makes up 60%. 20 are purple, which makes up 40%. Okay. So what you would expect is that if you divided these up into 5 districts, all right, that's our goal. We're going to divide these 50 people into 5 districts. let's look at a couple ways where what we call are the fair ways. Okay, we view these way as fair because if you're dividing these into 5 districts that are going to have 5 representatives represent this state in Congress, and the state is made up 60% orange, 40% purple, you would expect that would basically be broken up. 60% of the districts would go for the orange party, and 40% or 2 would go for the purple party. And you see, there is a way to do that. You can now. This is a very evenly distributed state where population is distributed very evenly. It's unrealistic, but just to show how it works, you have 3 districts drawn straight north and south. Those are all orange districts. You have 2 all purple districts, and so that gives you your 60%, 40% split. Remember, 3/5 equals 60%. So if you have 5 districts and 3 of them are orange, that 3/5 leads to 60%. But as we've talked about, states population is not evenly distributed, so you may not be able to just simply draw nice straight geometric lines. You may have to come up with funny shapes like you have on this one on the right, this one we're talking about. And you see that these shapes are slightly different shaped. Here on the bottom, you have what looks to be 8 orange and 2 purple. So that's going to be an orange majority state. But here in this next one, you have 6 purple and 4 orange. So that's going to be a purple majority state. Now we're going to flip again. 6 orange, 4 purple, orange majority. And now you're back to an 8-2 in favor of the orange. But here on top, you have 6 purple, 4 orange. So when it's all said and done, 3 of these districts have a majority of orange party voters. 2 of the districts have a majority of purple party voters. So you would expect that when election day rolls around, they're going to elect 3 members of the orange party and 2 members of the purple party to represent them in Congress, which if you go back here, when you're just counting before we divide it up, that's what you would have expected. 60% for orange, 40% for purple. All right, so both of these districts come out as you would expect them. But now we're going to focus on what we call the gerrymandered districts, where the results don't come out the way you would expect, which is 3 orange, 2 purple. All right, so let's look at this one on the left under the gerrymandered category. As you can see, this is drawn with perfect geometric precision. All right, we just draw straight lines, say east-west, right across this state. But the problem is each of those areas has 6 purple squares and 6 orange squares and 4 purple squares. So you end up having the 6-4 victory for the orange in all 5 districts. So this state would send 5 members of the orange party and 0 members of the purple party to the state. To the state legislature or the national legislature, whichever one you're talking about. All right, so this does not seem fair because basically, even though 40% of the people in your state are a member of the purple party, they actually get 0 representation. None of their fellow members of the purple party get elected to Congress. All right, and that doesn't seem fair to us. What seems probably even more unfair is this category on the far right. All right. Again, same state, 60% orange, 40% purple. But look how it's drawn up this time. In this district, all right, this sort of C-shaped district, you have 9 oranges and 1 purple. Same thing on the top left. Another C-shaped district, you have 9 oranges and 1 purple. Now, the orange party is going to overwhelmingly win those elections. All right, they have 9 times as many voters packed into that district. Let's remember that word here in a minute. But the other districts are all divided in a way where the purple has a slight majority. All right, so right here you get 6 purple, 4 orange. This one in the middle, right? Again, 6 purple, 4 orange. And now look how oddly shaped this one is. You have 2 oranges way up here. You have 2 oranges way down here. And now in the middle, you have these oranges, but they're members of a different district. All right, so this is a very oddly shaped district that's separating members of the same party. Okay? But the result is 6 purples, 4 orange, and again, finally, this one on the bottom right is again 6 purple, 4 orange. So what happens is, even though purple only make up 40% in the state, they end up getting 3 representatives, whereas the orange, who is the majority of the people of the state, have 2 representatives. All right, and so this is why gerrymandering is often thought to be unfair. And there are 2 ways, we've already explained it, but now let's talk about the terminology. There are 2 ways it can be done. One, packing, remember I just used that term, where you pack similar voters into just 1 or 2 districts. All right, and you see that in this far right. All right, whoever drew this map packed up to 9 orange voters into 1 district, and then pack 9 more into a 2nd district. So that, great, those orange voters are absolutely going to win those 2 districts, but they're going to lose the majority of the districts. They're going to lose the other 3. Okay. The other term is called cracking, and it's basically sort of the opposite, where you crack up groups into various different districts. And it's under the gerrymandering category. The one on the left shows cracking, where these purple voters, even though you could find a way where you could put them into majority districts, they're actually cracked up into 5 different districts. Okay? So these 20 voters are scattered among 5 different districts, so there's never a majority in any single district. Okay? And that is called cracking. All right, so understand those 2 terms. Packing is when you try to basically lessen someone's or a group's power by shoving all of them into 1 district, letting them win that district, but then lose all the surrounding district. Cracking is when you try to spread out their power so among such varied geographic regions that they never have power in any one particular region. All right, so a question perhaps you've been asking yourself, is gerrymandering legal? And the probably not too satisfying answer is sometimes, but sometimes maybe not. So let's talk about the general principle. And you see here, this is what gerrymandering could lead to, but it's what the courts say we should avoid. All right, you can't have within the same state a 2 million person district electing 1 legislature, and then a 10,000 person district electing 1 legislature, because if the bottom line is you need something akin to 1 person, 1 vote. And this concept came about I think the concept, just as how we think about democracy, has probably always been with us. We think it's unfair if my vote counts more than yours, or my vote counts less than yours. That just seems unfair to us. But the Supreme Court formalized this concept in a couple cases in the early 1960s, Baker v. Carr and Gray v. Sanders, where they used this 1 person, 1 vote to talk about, first in Baker v. Carr, they talked about Tennessee's districts, and they said, well, it's favoring people too much in rural districts. And if you see that, I'm going to go back here several slides for just a second. I'll just use this one. You can see how Texas could end up favoring people in rural. Because again, all the population centers in Texas are in Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, Houston region. But if you simply divided Texas into nice, equal geographic shapes, right, then people who live out here in the country in West Texas are going to have, relatively speaking, a whole lot more power than people living in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Because look, in that square I just drew, there's probably about 7 million people living, let me draw it again, in this square right here. And again, I'm somewhat just estimating these numbers, but let's just say that about 7 million people. So one person's vote counts for 1/7 millionth, right? But here, these areas, you might only have 100,000 people in this square. All right. So each person's vote is going to count so much more. All right. Think about a fraction. The smaller the denominator, or I'm sorry, the bigger the denominator. If you have 1 over denominator, and you're converting that to percentage, the larger the denominator, the smaller percentage you get. All right. So 1 over 2, remember that equals 50%. 1 over 100. All right, you have now a much bigger denominator. That 100 is your denominator. 1 over 100 is 1%. All right, so the larger the denominator, the smaller the percentage you get. And so if you're counting 1 over 7 million and comparing that to 1 over, say, 50,000, well, the 1 over 7 million is going to lead to a much smaller percentage. And so people in those populated centers aren't going to receive much of the vote. And that's what was said. In Baker v. Carr, they said, well, you can't just draw it in a way where people in rural, less populated areas get more of a vote than people who live in urban, more populated areas. And then in Gray v. Sanders, the Supreme Court said, okay, you also can't just draw it along county lines, because as we already talked about, some counties have a lot more people than others. Remember our example in Texas, Dallas County has 2.6 million people. Loving County has 169 people. If you drew your district representation based on counties, people in Loving County would have a much more powerful vote than people in Dallas County. So you can't base it just on county or based on strict geographic or square mile regions, because of population density issues can lead to unfairness. Another thing that is absolutely not allowed is to gerrymander based on race. All right, Supreme Court, in a couple companion cases from 1986, said no, you can't gerrymander based on race. So if you go back, let's back up here a few slides. When we were talking about this orange and purple state, I was talking about as if orange and purple represented political parties. And as we'll talk about here in a minute, that may or may not be legal. But if those are orange or purple squares represented different races, then absolutely no way, no how would gerrymandering be legal in those states. Because, again, the Supreme Court ruled in 1986 that gerrymandering based on race violates both the North Carolina case. It violated the Voting Rights Act, and then in the companion case, Shaw v. Reno, they said basing districts purely on race also violates the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. So if a state gerrymanders districts entirely on race, then those will be deemed unconstitutional, and they'll have to redraw the districts. Now, the example I was using was for political parties. And here's where my answer of is gerrymandering legal? I said, maybe sometimes, maybe no, comes from. If you gerrymander on pure political reasons, that may or may not be allowed, because the Supreme Court had a chance to rule it unconstitutional last year, and they didn't do so. In Rucho versus Common Cause, Supreme Court was looking at 2 different states. North Carolina, the districts have been drawn to favor the Republican Party. In Maryland, the districts have been drawn to favor the Democratic Party. And what the Supreme Court said is, well, you know what? We've thought about it, and we determined that gerrymandering based on political parties is really a political question that needs to be decided by the states. All right, so remember, you've done a lot of reading recently about the Supreme Court. We talked about it. Also, the Supreme Court only has jurisdiction over certain types of cases, and they basically said, you know, this isn't our job to get involved with state political fights among political parties within the various states. So the end result is Supreme Court really left it up to the states to decide if gerrymandering based purely on political parties is fair or not, or legal or not. Now, the postscript to that is a North Carolina state court later did rule that the districts in North Carolina had violated the North Carolina state constitution, and so they needed to be redrawn. So it's possible, depending on what each state's constitution says, what each state's courts say, it's possible that gerrymandering based on purely political party lines may be found to violate the law, but it's possible it may not. It's still a little bit of a gray area. Finally, why should we care? Well, on one hand, because it does violate our sense of justice. Okay? I think, you know, living in a democracy, we have this fundamental belief that everybody's vote should count. But yet, when you draw the districts in a way where one person's vote may count 2 or 3 times more than another person's vote, that just seems unfair to us, and so we don't really like it. It does violate our sense of justice. I would also argue that there's another reason, which is that if you're running for office as an incumbent, i.e. the person who's already in Congress, you have somewhere between a 90 to 98% chance of being reelected. Almost all members of Congress get reelected each and every time they run for office. And there are a lot of factors, but I would argue gerrymandering is one of them. Because, let's go back here. If they draw the districts to favor one particular party or another, well, it's hard to envision a way where someone of the other party could win. All right, so let's go ahead and look at this district on the far right example, the one where you had 9 oranges and 1 purple. Well, someone from the orange party is almost always going to win that district. All right, and so this makes it hard to hold politicians accountable for what they do in office, because their party at least is guaranteed to win these districts when they're gerrymandered like this. And now it does look like in the last few years there has been an increase in the number of incumbents who lose. And when I say increase, I mean from like 2% lose to maybe 10% don't get reelected. Not a big number, but it's still there. But it also, at least from the examples I can think of, they lost in the primary election. All right, they weren't being defeated by a member of a different party because, after all, they live in districts where 80-90% of the people in that district are on their same party. So they might lose to another member of the party, but it doesn't really lead to this election every other November where you really have 2 different parties really kind of battling out to see which side the voters want. So it gives a little too much job security to politicians. And so that's why I think gerrymandering is a problem. Maybe you can come up with your own reasons. So think about it. And this is an interesting year to think about it for 2 reasons. 1, it's an election year. And 2, it's also a census year. And so after the census is taken in 2020, We're going to decide how many districts each state gets, and all the states are going to start redrawing their lines. So you will see a lot of fights here over the next few years about groups claiming that they're being gerrymandered out of power. So that's something to keep an eye on as you go forward. And that is our lesson on gerrymandering.